Chapter 1. Finding God Through the Darkness. Heaven storms because the Spirit desires to be known. He oftentimes is preceded by the darkness until the darkness is exposed by the light of life. Inspired by John chapter 1, verses 4 through 9. As a 7-year-old, I viewed the side profile of my Uncle Carlisle's face as his body lay in the open coffin at Greaves Mortuary in Keokuk, Iowa. Greased black hair and a relaxed grin belied his rigid condition. Outside sat a skylight blue 1964 Mustang. Weeks earlier, my Aunt Margaret took Mom and me for a spin in the hardtop that had that new car smell. Now it served as car number 3 in the funeral procession of a stormy day, soon clouded over with darkness. On the way to Oakland Cemetery, Mom pointed to a square red brick building on our right with a gray peeling paint garage door below and 2 windows above that were boarded up with plywood. "We lived in the upstairs apartment when we were children," Mom commented as we followed the hearse to the cemetery. "How many live there?" I asked. "Your 4 aunts and your uncle, my mom, who died of blood clots before I was born, your Grandpa Renard, and me," she said. "All in that tiny apartment?" I asked. "Yep, it was the Depression, and there wasn't much to go around." "But they were rich compared to my family," my dad chimed in. "Why?" I asked. "Because they had food. They sold food in the grocery store," my dad explained. "We just had the shoe repair shop, and not too many people were shining their shoes back then." This was during the Great Depression in the late 1930s. "See that garage?" Mom pointed to the peeling gray door below the apartment. "Yeah." "That was the storefront. Grandpa Renard sold most of the food for the poor south side of Keokuk. A nickel for bread and 10 cents for a box of cereal," said Mom. My mom and dad met as children in that small town of Keokuk. Grandpa Edward Renard had owned the garage-sized grocery store in the early 1900s. It was just 3 blocks south of the Oakland Cemetery, where his bones now rested in an otherwise empty plot, once meant for the entire estranged family. Grandpa Renard frequently binged on alcohol, often flying into a rage, like the evening when my mom, her mother, 4 sisters, and 1 brother snuck out of the house to catch the premiere of Gone with the Wind at the Keokuk Theater. Returning home, they all had to be rushed into a closet by my grandmother to escape Grandpa Renard's drunken fury for having secretly escaped the apartment without his permission. His abusive curses imparted a lifelong effect that would plague each member of the family, including my incessantly worrisome mom, with some kind of emotional scarring long after the store was a discarded relic. Following the burial of Uncle Carlisle's body, my parents visited relatives after dropping me off at Grandma and Grandpa's shoe repair shop on Main Street. About the only redeeming aspect of sitting in the shop and inhaling shoe polish vapors occurred on a hot, muggy day when I inserted a dime into the vending machine and received a bottled Coca-Cola straight from heaven. River towns were just beginning to die in the 1960s after trains and planes replaced the commerce and trade along American rivers. A statue of Native American Chief Keokuk stood in the park peering across the Mississippi River as a quasi-mascot of the many long-forgotten people who withered into obscurity and dust, like my once successful Uncle Carlisle. That night, while sleeping in my grandmother's musty bungalow, I awoke around midnight to a badly timed howling wind after dreaming about the corpse I had viewed the day before. Somehow the fragrance of the carnations that were placed around the coffin had seeped into my nostrils. I smelled them throughout the day and into the night. Thank God we would be leaving Keokuk in the morning because that town seemed only to consist of old people, old buildings, the aging, and the dead. Death stuck with me for a long time after that and seemed to portend my own death decades later. We packed the car for our trip back to Chicago. Dad drove across the bridge above the Mississippi as its murky waters swirled below. I always thought the mighty Mississippi looked scary and silently feared that our car might swerve off the bridge due to the screeching noise the tires made as soon as we entered the bridgeway. I rolled down the window only to breathe in the pungent aroma of burnt corn. Its origin was the Hubbencher's electric starch factory, located on the nearby riverbank. After seeing my first dead body, I would associate the smell of death not with burnt corn, but with the sickening sweet smell of carnations that had dotted my uncle's coffin. As we drove, macabre thoughts kept swirling in my head, along with the lingering profile of Uncle Carlisle. "You okay?" Mom asked when my head turned to the back window to see the fading outline of Keokuk. "Is Uncle Carlisle on the ground now?" I asked. "He's in heaven," Mom offered, as she fiddled with the radio knob, probably in search of a Glenn Campbell song. "Does everybody go to heaven?" I asked. "Only God knows," she said. That was pretty much the end of our conversation for the rest of the 4-hour drive. Thoughts kept pouring through my young brain. Before then, the dead had only appeared in my life in entertaining Frankenstein and Dracula movies. The only funeral I ever saw on TV was that of John F. Kennedy the year before Uncle Carlisle's comparatively discreet affair. We drove by cemeteries here and there, but up to that point, death existed as a theoretical possibility, not an actual observed fact. Whenever a hearse passed by our midnight blue Plymouth, we religiously sang a one-liner. Oh my, the hearse drove by. Who will be the next one to die? But after seeing that dead body of my middle-aged uncle in the coffin, I no longer joked about dead people. I think his death instilled within me a perpetual fear that my own parents might one day bite the dust, as they say. After arriving home, life resumed in an altered state of normal. I say altered because as a sickly kid living in a 3-bedroom ranch-style home in Arlington Heights, Illinois, the thought had crossed my mind that I was unlike other normal kids. Most children would play and not run out of breath. My signature sound was a bubbling wheeze that proved a little embarrassing at the school cafeteria, not to mention unappetizing to would-be friends. Almost nightly, Mom would pound my back to loosen the congestion caused by asthma, while my high school-aged sister and brother tried to sleep. As a child, it just seemed normal to me, despite occasional trips to the hospital from collapsed lungs. Normal is a very relative term, and often interpreted from a rather biased viewpoint. I tried living like any normal kid, despite an inability to run without provoking an asthma attack. Naturally, a cat lived next door, and of course my friend Patty and I needed to hold the cat. Then my eyes would itch and I would wheeze. The next thing I would remember was Mom waking me up from the shaggy floor of our home as she shook me and pounded my back as if I had done something wrong. And you guessed it, another trip to the hospital. That was normal life for me. Dad got promoted to a sales manager position after selling dry ice and CO2 gas. Moving to the suburbs of Philadelphia and Cherry Hill, New Jersey as a first grader introduced me to another facet of death. One night, as my older brother's teenage friend sat on our white quilted living room sofa, I looked through the picture window to see an ambulance flash its lights across the street. The teen cupped his head in his hands for a while, then lifted his head when my mom offered him a hot chocolate. As he looked up, I could see his reddened eyes and tear-stained cheeks. My dad happened to be home after a long day managing a dry ice sales team. He stood next to me, so I asked him why Tony was crying. My dad bent down and whispered into my ear, "His dad died." "How?" I asked. A long pause followed as my dad looked out the window. He wore his satiny suit with his oiled hair that normally made him appear regal. But now, because he slumped and some hairs were unusually out of place, he seemed different. I looked closely and saw something in his eyes that resembled a tear. He and Tony's dad were about the same age, and they played couples bridge together. His eyes stared at those flashing ambulance lights, then at Tony, back and forth like a tennis match. It seemed like forever before my dad's eyes finally turned toward me. "Probably a heart attack. I'm not sure. But it was too late when the ambulance got there." "Did Tony find him there?" My thinking was that if Tony found him dead, then somehow he was now contaminated with some kind of death cooties. I didn't want to be around Tony anymore. I figured that just being around someone who had lost someone automatically contaminated them and possibly invited the effects of death to come after them. A child's mind can go to the strangest places. Even stranger to me than death was God. I had seen death, but God remained a mystery rarely considered. As a boy, I believed that God primarily resided at St. Andrew's Methodist Church in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. That was because the only time God came up in discussion was on Sunday morning at 10 a.m., and darn if the church folks didn't place those wretched-smelling carnations at the front. Once services began, hell always seemed more real than heaven. For me, the only thing worse than learning about Noah, Moses, and all the other ancients was the hell of being sandwiched in those unforgiving wooden pews and listening to a droning pastor turn words into sounds worse than fingernails scratching a chalkboard. At least the chalkboard scratching didn't bore me to death. Then, something life-changing happened. It was another death of sorts. The death of whatever faith one was supposed to believe as a so-called Christian. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, after which we stopped going to church. I saw the letter on my dad's desk sit there for weeks, which sparked my curiosity. After school one day, I read that letter, removing it from atop my dad's desk. The desk's presence alone was significant, as Mom and me had spent weeks sanding and staining it after retrieving the 2,000-pound 1930s office castaway from a junkyard. Now that desk served as the only place I could see my dad, albeit buried in papers on weeknights if he wasn't traveling for work. At least occasionally I could watch him tap, tap, tap his foot in sync with some performer on the Lawrence Welk TV show as he sat at the desk. I turned my attention to the letterhead that I held in my hands and that said St. Andrew's Methodist Church at the top. The body of the letter said something to the effect of this. Dear Mr. K, we regret to inform you that since you have not honored your tithing commitment to this church for X amount of time, you have been excommunicated from our church. At the time, I didn't understand the word excommunicated, but Mom later explained that we wouldn't be attending that church anymore. I knew after looking that word up in the dictionary that the church had kicked my dad out because he didn't pay them. I thought about how my dad had served as a hero in the Pacific Fleet during World War II, saving lives after a kamikaze attack. Now the church made him out to be a loser. I think that was the point when I rejected the church. I never thought very highly of it in the first place. Now this confirming offense against my heroic dad was the proverbial last straw. If the church didn't want my dad, then I didn't want the church. And because the church represented God, I didn't think very much of God. Later on, I believed that the key to the so-called greatest generation had much to do with their fortitude in following through with commitments, even when others did not. They also worked very hard in those days, for very little pay. Ironically, the church did not seem to demonstrate that same kind of fortitude, or as they said back then, stick-to-itiveness. I entered puberty at Brainerd Junior High School, where life reinforced my God is irrelevant tacit belief, if I had any beliefs at all. As a budding teen, I ballooned to be one of the heaviest fat kids in school, as they said. A cadre of student terrorists often reminded me of this fact as they spread their conviction that I was the, quote, nerd fat boy, end of quote, who gave them all, quote, cooties, end of quote. In grade school, I'd attended speech therapy to correct my stuttering. During that training, I learned to speak more slowly and deliberately, but the stress caused me to stutter again, thus providing more fodder for the bullies. Being in homeroom with the three chief terrorists, Joel, Vincent, and Jeffrey, was akin to being trapped in a prison cell with three adolescent stranglers who smelled bad. Mom bought me some trendy checkered bell-bottom pants and a contrasting striped shirt to wear to school, which, when worn, lit me up with a neon arrow that screamed, "Kick me to the devourers." The bullies scorched me with their taunts. Naturally, most of the students joined in the chants, while a few, along with our homeroom teacher, Mrs. Pfeiffer, tried to ignore them. It was perhaps the first time most of the students actually dug their heads into any school textbook. Further confirming God's absence, one harrowing day, I escaped to the library in search of an isolated nook where I placed my books and a 3-ring binder that was full of notes on a small table. After that, I went to the bookshelves in search of the title Chicago and found a book to bury my head inside. I read about Chicago history, hoping to one day return to that beloved city. The picture showed Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in an 1871 barn, which started the Great Chicago Fire, burning an area roughly 4 miles long and a mile wide in the Windy City, including its business district. Now, there's a woman with bad luck, I thought. Why couldn't that have been my school? I mused. After returning the book to its shelf, I walked back to my desk only to find all of my notebook papers scattered throughout the library. My textbooks had somehow managed to find themselves lodged within the swing door of the library's metal trash can. Not once did I experience a day of peace during class or at recess. Even gym class salted my wounds. I often caved to the ground, heaving for breath, confirming perceptions that I was a vulnerable weakling. My only reprieve from sneers and taunts came when I got sick, allowing me the luxury of staying home to enjoy reruns of Leave It to Beaver and Dennis the Menace. On wintry snow days, I recall intently listening to the radio as the broadcaster announced each and every school closure. When he would finally call out the name Brainerd, Christmas came early that year. I did have one friend, though, Jimmy. On weekends, we played catch. He hailed from Alabama with a thick southern drawl and a buzz cut identical to his ex-Marine dad. Jimmy and I would stand together each school day at the corner, awaiting our bus. One day I stayed home from school because I had, well, quote-unquote, caught a cold. I commonly caught colds because of my damaged lungs. That day, as Jimmy stood alone at the bus stop, a gang from nearby Camden happened along looking for trouble. Soon they discovered a kid with straight pants that stopped an inch above his ankles, standing vulnerable and alone at the corner. Later, police discovered that the gang from neighboring Camden had heard Jimmy's thick Southern accent and immediately identified him as a Southern segregationist or quote-unquote racist pig, even though Jimmy probably didn't understand the word. Back then, race was a term children heard only on the news, as when Martin Luther King Jr. marched in the streets. Regardless, the gang decided to bash Jimmy's head into a tree, which broke open his skull. It took weeks for Jimmy to recover once he left the hospital. During that time, Mr. Hobby placed a for sale sign on their front lawn. Jimmy never returned to school. My only friend moved back to Alabama. I was alone, except for my little rat terrier, Casey, and Mom, since my dad worked most days and nights on the few occasions he wasn't traveling. When I returned from school after a long day of harassments, Casey would climb onto my lap and feverishly lick my face. He maintained an uncanny ability to sense the darkest of my moods, and each time his cure was a free lick facial. On days when the sun shined, I would link Casey to a long chain so he could roam the yard freely and sit under the large oak tree for shade. Most afternoons, I would look through the back picture window to watch the silliest battles. A squirrel would casually wait for Casey to notice him and then race to the outer limit of Casey's chain. Then the squirrel would perch just beyond Casey's reach and purposely taunt him as it munched on a nut. Maybe one day Casey would catch the squirrel and then no more squirrel, I thought to myself. Well, that day came. When Casey ran to the end of the chain, it snapped, and the squirrel froze. Casey and that squirrel were suddenly face to face in a furry standoff. I rushed out the back door to save my little friend from a fight, but when I reached the scene, Casey just stared at the frozen squirrel that had suddenly up and died. Perhaps it had a heart attack from the shock. I will never know, but the event would be retold countless times by my father and me as a kind of humorous bond between us. The standoff had finally happened and little Casey had won. If not for my dog and his various escapades, life as a scorned adolescent might have been unbearable. The thought of whether dogs existed in heaven never crossed my mind, although more than 3 decades later, I would be fortunate to discover the answer.